Back on my
book form southbound.
stop stick, stop stick, stop stick.
He's gonna lose it here in a minute.
It was just before sunrise in Atlanta when the piercing sound of sirens broke through the quiet of the neighborhood. Police tape fluttered in the cool morning breeze, marking off the entrance to a modest apartment complex. Inside one of those units, a crime scene unfolded that would leave neighbors shaken and friends devastated. The victim was Ashley Burton, a young transgender woman whose life had been cut short in the very place she should have felt most safe, her own home. Her body was discovered after frantic calls from concerned neighbors who reported strange noises, followed by an eerie silence. What officers found inside was a haunting image. The scene of an attack that was as sudden as it was brutal, and a life extinguished far too soon. There was no goodbye note, no chance for her to fight back or explain what had happened. Just stillness. Just questions, and those questions echoed louder than anything else. Who could have done this? Why Ashley? And what kind of anger or desperation leads someone to kill a young woman who had her entire future ahead of her? But before we can begin to untangle the web of this tragedy, we need to go back to who Ashley was, to the life she was building, and to the moments that led up to the morning when everything changed. Ashley Burton was not just another name in the headlines. She was vibrant, creative, and determined. Those who knew her described her as someone who lit up any room she walked into. She had an eye for beauty, whether in fashion, makeup, or photography, and she dreamed of building a career where she could share that passion with the world. For Ashley, life wasn't just about surviving. It was about expressing herself unapologetically. Growing up wasn't easy. Being transgender in a world that still carries deep prejudice meant Ashley had to fight battles most people never see. From the stares in public to the whispers behind her back, she faced discrimination that wore on her spirit. Yet she refused to let it define her. She carried herself with confidence, and even when the world tried to push her down, she stood taller. Her social media reflected that defiance, a carefully curated mix of joy, style, and raw honesty about what it meant to live as her true self. But behind the smiles in her photos, Ashley was no stranger to fear. She knew the statistics. She knew that transgender women, especially Black transgender women, are among the most targeted for violence in America. Every headline about another life lost weighed on her. Friends later revealed she had confided about her worries, but she brushed them off with the kind of bravery that comes when you have no choice but to keep moving forward. Then came that early morning in April. Neighbors recalled hearing an argument in Ashley's apartment, muffled voices, raised in tension. It wasn't the first time they'd heard something unusual coming from that unit, but this time was different. The voices escalated. Then, suddenly, there was silence. A heavy silence that stretched on until someone decided to call for help. By the time police arrived, it was already too late. Ashley's body was discovered inside her apartment, lifeless. The details of how she was killed were chilling, but investigators kept them close, careful not to release too much information too soon. What mattered was clear enough. Someone had taken her life, and whoever they were, they had left behind no easy trail to follow. Word spread quickly, first through the neighborhood and then across social media. Friends, activists, and complete strangers who had never met Ashley began posting her photos, demanding justice, refusing to let her name become another statistic in the growing list of transgender women lost to violence. Candlelight vigils were organized, where people spoke her name with reverence, promising to keep her story alive. And yet, in the midst of grief, The questions only grew darker. Was Ashley targeted because she was transgender? Was this personal someone she knew? Someone who carried resentment or rage? Or was it random, a cruel act of violence with no explanation? Investigators faced the daunting task of piecing together the last hours of Ashley's life. They combed through phone records, spoke to neighbors, searched her apartment for evidence, but as days turned into weeks, answers remained elusive. The case wasn't just about forensics, it was about unraveling the complexity of Ashley's life, her relationships, and the dangers that come with being part of a marginalized community. And here's where the story begins to twist, because in Ashley's case, there were whispers of conflicts, of relationships gone wrong, of secrets that might have followed her into that apartment on the night she died. But what was rumor and what was truth? The line between the two blurred quickly, and the deeper investigators looked, the more tangled the picture became. Ashley Burton's death was not just one woman's tragedy. It was part of a broader, painful reality, a reminder of the risks faced daily by transgender women across America. Yet, focusing only on statistics strips away the humanity, the uniqueness of each life lost. Ashley was not a number. She was a daughter, a friend, a dreamer. She deserved more than what she got that morning. And as her story begins to unfold, we are left with the chilling uncertainty of that apartment in Atlanta. Who walked through her door that night? And why didn't she walk back out? Before we move further into this story, remember there's much more to come, and what lies ahead may surprise you. If you want to follow every twist and turn, don't forget to subscribe, because the truth behind Ashley Burton's case is far from simple, and the answers may leave you speechless. When detectives began retracing Ashley Burton's last days, they weren't just looking for evidence. They were searching for a pattern, a crack in her circle of friends, lovers, or acquaintances that might explain how she ended up dead inside her own apartment. Every crime scene tells a story, the trick is learning how to read it. Ashley's apartment itself provided few immediate answers. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no kicked-in doors. Whoever had been with her that night had either been let in willingly or already had a way inside. That fact alone shifted the focus of the investigation. This was unlikely to be the work of a stranger wandering the streets. The killer was someone Ashley knew. Neighbors described hearing voices that night. Not shouting at first, just a heated conversation. The kind of muffled argument where emotions spill out in hushed tones before rising. They couldn't make out the words, but the rhythm of tension was unmistakable. Then came the sudden drop into silence, a silence that left the air feeling heavy, unnatural. Detectives took note. Arguments rarely end in murder unless there's a history beneath them. Resentment, betrayal, something long brewing, finally snapping. The question was, what, or who, was Ashley tied to that carried such weight? Ashley was known for her openness, but like anyone, she had her private struggles. Friends spoke of her determination to live authentically, but they also hinted at challenges in her relationships. She had admirers, people drawn to her confidence and beauty. But not all of those connections were healthy. Some carried secrecy, the kind of secrecy that breeds shame and anger. In communities where trans identities are still misunderstood or stigmatized, relationships can become complicated. Men who were interested in Ashley might have felt pressure to keep those connections hidden. To them, Ashley wasn't someone they could proudly introduce to family or friends. Instead, she became a secret, cherished in private, but denied in public. And secrets like that, investigators knew, often carried dangerous consequences. Police began combing through Ashley's phone, pulling call logs, texts, and messages from apps. They needed to know who she'd been speaking with, who might have been in her apartment that night. Some names were familiar to her friends. Others were strangers, people Ashley hadn't spoken about openly. But one thing was clear. There were multiple conversations happening in the days leading up to her death, and at least one of them had ended in violence. Meanwhile, word of Ashley's death was spreading beyond her circle. News outlets reported her killing with varying levels of sensitivity. Some headlines respected her identity, while others misgendered her, stripping away her dignity even in death. For many in the LGBTQ community, it was another painful reminder of how society often fails transgender victims, erasing their truth in the very moment they should be remembered most clearly. Vigils grew in number. People lit candles, held up photos of Ashley smiling, and demanded justice. Activists spoke passionately about the epidemic of violence facing Black transgender women, urging authorities not to let her case fade into silence. But protests and vigils could not produce the evidence detectives needed. For that, they had to keep digging into Ashley's personal life. One lead came from a friend who revealed that Ashley had mentioned feeling unsafe in the days before her death. She didn't go into detail, but she hinted that someone she knew had become unpredictable, even threatening. Detectives clung to that revelation. If Ashley had confided her fears, it meant there was likely a person she had been wary of, and perhaps that same person had been in her apartment the night she died. But fear doesn't always point directly to a killer. People in difficult relationships often live in gray areas torn between love, hope, and fear. Ashley was no exception. Friends described her as someone who forgave easily, sometimes too easily. Even when she was hurt, she often gave people second chances, hoping they would change. Was this generosity of spirit what left her vulnerable? As investigators interviewed more people, they encountered whispers of jealousy, of partners who felt possessive, of arguments fueled by secrecy and shame. Some men, it turned out, had insisted that Ashley keep their relationships hidden, and Ashley, proud as she was, sometimes struggled with the weight of being someone's secret rather than their truth. Still, the hardest part for those who loved her was not knowing. Rumors swirled, theories multiplied, but answers remained scarce. Who had been in her apartment that night? Why had things escalated so suddenly? And why had Ashley, a woman so full of life, ended up alone in the very space she should have been safest? Detectives knew the first 48 hours of a murder investigation were crucial. But days were passing, and the case was growing colder by the hour. Each lead raised new possibilities, but none yet pointed conclusively to the person who had silenced Ashley Burton forever. For her family, the pain was almost unbearable. They remembered Ashley not as a victim, but as a daughter and sister. She had dreams they would never see fulfilled. She had laughter they would never hear again. In interviews, they pleaded with the public for help, begging anyone who knew something to come forward. But would anyone step up? Or would Ashley's case, like so many others, risk being forgotten, lost in the shadows of unsolved violence? And here's where the story sharpens into a haunting edge. Because investigators were about to uncover something buried in Ashley's digital footprint, a piece of evidence that hinted at who had been in her life during those final days. It wasn't enough to name a killer yet, but it was enough to change the direction of the case. The silence of that apartment, the unanswered questions, the shadows cast over Ashley's life, all of it was about to collide with the reality of what investigators found. But would it lead to justice, or only deepen the mystery? There's more to Ashley's story than what you've heard so far, and the next turn may shock you. If you want to follow every twist and every revelation, don't forget to subscribe, because what comes next will make you question everything you thought you knew about this case. Every murder investigation has a moment when the fog begins to thin, when scattered details start to align into a pattern. For detectives working on Ashley Burton's case, that moment came when they began piecing together her digital footprint. Her phone and social media accounts, once just streams of conversations and posts, suddenly looked like a map of her final days, a map pointing toward danger. The texts were ordinary at first. Friends checking in, small talk, a joke here, an emoji there, but hidden among them were darker tones. Arguments with someone she was close to, apologies followed by anger, promises that seemed fragile, even desperate. The more detectives read, the clearer it became. Ashley had been entangled in something complicated, something that may have turned deadly. One name surfaced more than once. A man who had been in contact with Ashley repeatedly in the weeks leading up to her death. Their exchanges swung wildly between affection and hostility. Sometimes he seemed tender, telling her how much he cared. Other times his words cut sharp, accusing her, blaming her, lashing out. Detectives looked closer. Who was this man to Ashley? A lover? A confidant? Or something more dangerous? Someone she trusted, but who saw her as a secret to be hidden? When investigators tracked him down for questioning, his story raised eyebrows. He admitted knowing Ashley, admitted spending time with her, but he insisted he hadn't seen her on the night she died. His alibi was thin, built on vague claims of being elsewhere, unsupported by anyone else's testimony. And then came the most chilling discovery. In one of Ashley's last saved messages, she mentioned feeling scared, writing to a friend, "If anything happens to me, you'll know who it was." Those words echoed through the investigation like a ghost. Who was she referring to? And had she unknowingly written her own epitaph? While detectives pressed forward, the community outside kept the pressure on. Vigils turned into marches. Chants demanding justice rang out in the streets. Activists pointed to the alarming pattern. Black transgender women across America were being killed at staggering rates, and too often, their cases went unsolved. Would Ashley's case join that painful list? The media coverage, inconsistent at first, grew louder as the community spoke up. More people began to learn Ashley's name, her story, her truth. But with visibility came tension. Detectives felt the weight of public scrutiny, the demand for answers clashing with the slow grind of forensic evidence and witness interviews. Behind closed doors, investigators debated their theories. Was this a crime of passion, an argument that spiraled out of control, or was it premeditated, a deliberate act by someone desperate to silence Ashley and protect their own reputation? The lack of forced entry still haunted them. Ashley had known her killer. That much was clear. She had opened the door willingly, let them inside. This wasn't random violence. This was personal. Her friends offered more insight. Ashley had been caught between wanting love and being tired of secrecy. She wanted someone who would embrace her, openly, proudly, without hesitation. But some of the men she'd been involved with weren't ready to do that. They wanted her in the shadows, not the sunlight. That secrecy, detectives realized, wasn't just about romance. It was about shame, fear of judgment, even fear of exposure. For some men, the idea of being seen with a transgender woman threatened their public image, their masculinity, their fragile sense of control. That fear could curdle into rage, and rage, when mixed with intimacy, is often deadly. Still, suspicion is not proof. Detectives needed evidence, something concrete to tie their prime suspect to the crime scene. And that's when forensics delivered. Fingerprint analysis revealed partial prints on items inside Ashley's apartment, not unusual for someone she knew. But what stood out was the timing. Security footage from the building showed that the suspect's car had been parked outside on the very night Ashley was killed. His denial of being there crumbled under that evidence. The walls were closing in, but as pressure mounted, the suspect clung to his story. He claimed he had nothing to do with Ashley's death. He suggested others might have been involved, throwing out names and theories to muddy the waters. But every attempt to deflect only made him look more suspicious. Meanwhile, Ashley's family was desperate. Each new development brought hope, then frustration, then exhaustion. They wanted justice, but they feared the system would fail her. They had seen it happen before: cases where transgender victims were misrepresented, where killers walked free, where silence swallowed the truth. And yet, even as evidence grew, another chilling possibility emerged. Could Ashley's killer have had help? Was someone else there that night, covering for him, or even participating? Some inconsistencies in the timeline hinted at more than one person being involved. The thought was almost too much to bear. Still, detectives pressed forward with what they had. The case was no longer a mystery of who. It was a race to prove it. To gather enough evidence that would hold up in court, to build a case so strong that no lawyer, no jury, no shadow of doubt could set the killer free. But the question lingered in the minds of Ashley's friends and loved ones. Even if an arrest was made, would justice truly be served? Or would Ashley, like so many before her, become just another statistic, her name spoken in grief, but forgotten in law? The investigation was reaching its boiling point. A suspect in the spotlight, evidence circling tighter, the community watching every move. Something had to give, and soon it would, because in the next chapter of Ashley's story, the pursuit of justice takes a dramatic turn, one that would reveal not just the truth of her final moments, but the deeper failures of a society still struggling to protect its most vulnerable. The knock on his door came early in the morning. Detectives, armed with a warrant, stepped into the dim apartment of the man they believed had taken Ashley Burton's life. He looked startled, though perhaps not surprised. For weeks, suspicion had been circling him like vultures, closing in closer with every piece of evidence. At first, he tried to maintain his calm. He insisted he was innocent, that this was all a mistake, that Ashley's death had nothing to do with him. But when confronted with the footage of his car outside her apartment that night, his face hardened. He knew they had him. Still, he refused to confess. The community held its breath when word of the arrest spread. For Ashley's friends, it felt like a victory, a step toward justice. Though it was bittersweet, they had lost her, and no trial could bring her back. But at least, they thought, the truth was beginning to surface. But the truth is never simple. And in Ashley's case, it was tangled in secrecy, shame, and denial. In the days that followed, prosecutors worked tirelessly to build their case. They uncovered details of the suspect's relationship with Ashley, a relationship defined by contradictions. He cared for her, maybe even loved her in his own fractured way, but he also wanted to keep her hidden. To him, Ashley was someone to cherish in the dark, but deny in the light. That push and pull, detectives believed, had led to her death. They painted a picture of a man torn between desire and fear, caught between his private life and the image he wanted to project. In the end, that inner conflict erupted in violence. But proving that in court would be another matter entirely. Ashley's family sat through every hearing, their grief on display in silent tears and clenched hands. They listened as defense attorneys tried to cast doubt, suggesting there wasn't enough evidence, that Ashley may have had other enemies, that someone else could have been responsible. Each word felt like another blow not only to Ashley's memory, but to the truth they had been fighting so hard to preserve. For many in the transgender community, this was a familiar pain. They had seen victims' lives dissected in court, their identities questioned, their humanity debated as if it were on trial too. Would Ashley face the same fate? And then, the unthinkable happened. Prosecutors, despite the evidence, began to worry. The case wasn't ironclad. There was no murder weapon directly linking the suspect. No eyewitness who had seen the moment it happened. The strongest pieces were circumstantial. The car, the texts, the fingerprints powerful. Yes, but not always enough for a conviction in front of a jury. The fear was real. What if he walked free? In a twist that shocked Ashley's supporters, the man accused of killing her was offered a plea deal. Instead of facing trial for murder, he would plead guilty to a lesser charge. It was a compromise meant to secure some measure of accountability. But for Ashley's family, it felt like betrayal. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered. They held signs with Ashley's name, demanding real justice, not half measures. Their voices rose in anger and sorrow. Say her name, justice for Ashley. But inside the system, the deal was done. The suspect would serve time, yes, but not for as long as many believed he deserved. He would not be branded a murderer in the eyes of the law. Ashley's mother wept when the sentence was read. She spoke afterward with trembling words. They didn't just take my baby from me. Now they're taking justice from her too, for the community. It was a bitter reminder of how often transgender victims are failed. Not just by the people who hurt them, but by the institutions meant to protect them. Too often, their lives are treated as less valuable, their cases as less urgent. Too often, killers walk away with lighter punishments, hidden behind legal deals and technicalities. And so, Ashley's name joined a list no one wants to be part of. A list of women whose deaths raised awareness, but didn't receive full justice. Yet even in that heartbreak, Ashley's story refused to fade. Her friends carried her memory forward through art, through marches, through conversations that demanded change. They refused to let her be forgotten, refused to let her death be just another statistic. Because Ashley Burton was not just a headline. She was not just a case file. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She was a woman with dreams, laughter, and love to give. She deserved so much more than the fate she received. In the end, the courtroom closed, but the questions remained. How many more Ashleys will there be before society decides enough is enough? How many more families will sit through trials that don't deliver justice? How many times will silence, secrecy, and shame cost someone their life? The arrest gave hope, the sentence gave disappointment, and the story of Ashley Burton left everyone asking, what does justice really look like when the system itself is broken? And just when it seemed the case was over, another revelation surfaced, one that would change how people remembered Ashley's final days forever. In the weeks before her death, Ashley's friends noticed something in her voice. She laughed as she always did, but sometimes it carried an edge, a weariness she couldn't quite hide. She was juggling her dreams of building a better future with the unshakable weight of secrets. There were times she confided in those closest to her. She told them about the man she was seeing, about how he made her feel alive in one moment and invisible in the next. He kept her at a distance when others were around. He wouldn't acknowledge her openly. For Ashley, that hurt deeply. She wanted to be loved out loud, not in shadows. One friend later recalled Ashley's words, "I just want someone who's not afraid to stand by me, to see me, really see me." It was a simple wish, yet one that proved devastatingly out of reach. On her last day alive, Ashley went about her routine as if nothing were wrong. She answered calls, sent texts, even posted light-hearted messages online. Outwardly, it looked like any other day, but beneath that normalcy, pieces of her life were shifting. Plans had been made, arguments whispered, and choices set in motion. Later, investigators would piece together a chilling timeline. The suspect had contacted her, arranging to see her that night. Some believe he came to end things, unable to bear the tension of living a double life. Others believe he feared exposure, that Ashley, tired of being hidden, was ready to demand more. Whatever the truth, that night became the turning point. For Ashley's family, the hardest part was imagining her final moments. Did she know what was about to happen? Did she fight, cry out, beg for her life? Or was it sudden, leaving her no chance to say goodbye? These are questions that will never fully be answered. Questions that haunt them still. Her brother once said, "When I close my eyes, I try to picture her smile, not the way she died. But the mind doesn't always let you choose." When the news broke of Ashley's death, shockwaves rippled not only through Atlanta, where she lived, but across the country. Friends posted tributes filled with love and heartbreak. Strangers lit candles at vigils, their faces illuminated in the glow of flickering flames. But alongside grief came anger. People weren't just mourning Ashley, they were furious at the way she was taken and at the system that seemed unwilling to fight for her. Activists spoke out, reminding the world that Ashley's story was not isolated. She was one of many transgender women of color whose lives ended violently, whose names too often faded in silence. This time, they said, silence would not win. At vigils, voices rose in chants. "Say her name. Ashley Burton. Say her name." Each word was both a plea and a demand that Ashley not be forgotten, that her life be honored with action, not just tears. For Ashley's mother, those gatherings were bittersweet. She was grateful her daughter was loved by so many, but she also carried a grief too heavy for words. Standing among crowds, she often felt both surrounded and alone. Because while others held candles, she held memories of bedtime stories, school mornings, the sound of Ashley's laughter filling their home, memories that no one could give back. As the weeks turned into months, more details of Ashley's final days emerged. Investigators revealed text messages between her and the suspect. Messages that painted a story of longing and rejection. Ashley wanted commitment. He wanted control. She wanted to be embraced. He wanted to keep her hidden. Those texts were the last fragments of her voice, frozen in digital ink. They were reminders of a woman who had wanted so little, just love, honesty, and acceptance, and who paid the ultimate price for it. The trial may have ended with disappointment, but Ashley's story didn't end there. Her death sparked new conversations in schools, churches, and communities. Parents began asking themselves how they could better support their LGBTQ children. Friends confronted their own biases, realizing how silence and shame can kill just as surely as violence. And lawmakers, pressured by activists, were forced to acknowledge the rising tide of violence against transgender people. Bills were proposed, conversations debated, and though change was slow, Ashley's name was among those fueling the urgency. Her friends continued to speak about her whenever they could. They told stories of her kindness, her humor, her determination. One recalled how Ashley could light up a room simply by walking in, how her energy was contagious. Another shared how she once gave her last $20 to help a friend buy groceries, even though Ashley herself had little to spare. She was, above all else, someone who cared, someone who gave, someone who deserved to live. But the haunting reality remained. Ashley's life was stolen in a moment of violence rooted in fear and shame. And until society reckons with those forces, more lives will be lost. Her story became a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about gender, identity, and the fragility of acceptance. It forced people to ask themselves, why is it so dangerous for someone simply to exist as who they are? Why is love, in its truest form, so often overshadowed by prejudice? Ashley Burton's last days were filled with hope, laughter, and dreams, but also with struggles she should never have had to carry. Her death left behind an empty space that can never be filled. Yet her voice, silenced too soon, continues to echo in the fight for justice, equality, and love without fear. Because even in her absence, Ashley is still here. In every candle lit, in every chant shouted, in every heart that refuses to forget. And in her story, there is one final lesson: that silence is deadly, but remembrance is power. The courtroom may have fallen silent when the verdict was read, but Ashley Burton's story never ended there. Her absence continued to echo in every space she once filled. For her family, every holiday carried a seat left empty. For her friends, nights out were marked by a missing laugh that once rose above the music. And for the community, her name became a rallying cry that demanded not to be forgotten. The pain of her loss was undeniable. Yet from that pain, something powerful began to grow. In the months following her death, murals began appearing across Atlanta. Bright, defiant colors painted on brick walls showed Ashley's face surrounded by flowers and butterflies. Passers-by would stop, some in tears, others in awe. These murals weren't just art, they were declarations. They screamed what society too often tried to silence. Ashley lived. Ashley mattered. Ashley deserved more. At one mural unveiling, her best friend took the microphone. Her voice shook, but her words carried strength. Ashley wasn't perfect, but none of us are. She was real. She was love. And the world is darker without her. But as long as we speak her name, she's still here. The crowd responded with applause that rolled like thunder. And in that moment, it was as if Ashley herself was standing among them, smiling, proud. But even as her story inspired art and activism, it also revealed raw wounds in the justice system. Many asked, how could a life be taken so brutally? Yet accountability remained so elusive. Why did fear of her identity become a shield for her killer? Legal experts debated the case, pointing out how panic defense's arguments rooted in prejudice were still quietly being used in courtrooms across America, defenses that excused violence by blaming the victim for simply existing. For Ashley's supporters, it felt like salt poured into an already bleeding wound. It raised a chilling question. If justice could be denied to Ashley so easily, what hope was there for others like her? Yet through grief and outrage, Ashley's family chose resilience. Her mother became a quiet force, speaking at events, urging parents to love their children unconditionally. She told crowds, "If I could go back, I'd tell Ashley every single day how proud I was of her." Don't wait to say those words. Don't wait until it's too late. Her brother, though often reluctant to step into the spotlight, honored her in quieter ways. He carried her photo in his wallet. He shared her story whenever he met someone willing to listen. For him, keeping Ashley alive in memory was his form of justice. Nationally, Ashley's name joined a heartbreaking list, a roll call of transgender women of color who had lost their lives to violence. Advocacy groups spoke of her at marches, vigils, and conferences. Her story was retold on podcasts, in news articles, and across social media. Each retelling carried the same promise. We won't let her be erased. And slowly, change began to stir. Cities passed resolutions condemning panic defenses. Training programs were implemented for law enforcement to handle cases involving LGBTQ victims with greater care. Laws took shape, not fast enough, but enough to prove that Ashley's death had forced society to look itself in the mirror. But beyond laws and protests, Ashley's story touched something more personal: the quiet conversations happening in homes across America. Parents talked with their children about acceptance, friends questioned their own biases, teachers created safer spaces in classrooms. One young woman, attending a vigil, shared how hearing Ashley's story gave her the courage to come out to her family. Another said, it pushed her to volunteer at a local shelter for LGBTQ youth. Ashley's life, though cut short, continued to ripple outward in ways she could never have imagined. Still, unanswered questions remain, lingering like shadows at the edges of her story. Could her death have been prevented if society valued her life differently? If the justice system had held firmer, would others be safer today? Or perhaps the most haunting question of all: how many more names will we have to say before the violence stops? These questions don't have easy answers, but they demand that we keep asking, keep challenging, keep refusing to let silence take hold. Because silence, after all, was the weapon that allowed Ashley's killer to live a double life. Silence was the chain that kept her love hidden, and silence, if left unchecked, could bury her story along with her. But Ashley's voice deserves better. Her legacy now lives not in the courtroom files or police reports, but in the people who carry her forward, in the artist painting her face on city walls, in the mother telling her story to strangers, in the friend who still whispers her name under the stars, and in you, listening now, deciding what you'll do with her story. Will you let it fade into another tragic headline? Or will you remember Ashley Burton not just for how she died, but for how she lived with courage, kindness, and a desire for love that every human being deserves? The candles may have burned out at her vigil that night, but the flame she sparked continues to burn, in hearts, in voices, in movements that refuse to be quiet. Ashley Burton's life was stolen, but her story is unending. It's a story that asks us to look closer, love deeper, and fight harder for a world where no one has to hide who they are. And perhaps that is the truest justice of all. There's a lot more to this story that will leave you speechless. And if you've found Ashley's story worth hearing, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because her fight is not over, and neither is ours.